There are places in this world you were never meant to see. Rooms that were never meant to be opened. Stories that were never meant to be told. And yet somehow you found this one. Maybe you clicked out of curiosity, maybe boredom. Maybe something inside you recognized the feeling, the quiet pull toward things hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Because the truth is, most people walk through the world asleep. They believe danger announces itself loudly. They think evil wears a mask that's easy to recognize. But the men who survive long enough in this world learn something different. They learn that the most disturbing things don't scream, they whisper. Sometimes they whisper through abandoned hallways where the dust hasn't moved in decades. Sometimes they whisper from the darkness just outside your front door. And sometimes they whisper from the smiling face sitting across from you in a crowded bar. Tonight, you're going to hear 3 stories, real stories, not ghosts, not monsters, something much worse. People. People doing things that don't make sense. People hiding intentions you were never supposed to notice. And moments where someone realized far too late that they had walked straight into the wrong place at the wrong time, surrounded by the wrong kind of people. But before we begin, understand something. These stories aren't just about fear. They're about awareness, about the moment a man realizes the world is far stranger and far darker than he was ever told. Because once you see certain things, once your brain recognizes the patterns, you can't go back. The illusion breaks. You start noticing the signs, the quiet ones, the ones most people miss. And the first story begins exactly like that. 4 bored friends, a summer night, an abandoned middle school sitting in the dark like a corpse nobody bothered to bury. They thought they were just going exploring, but the moment they stepped inside that building, someone else already knew they were there. And the scariest part, those people had been waiting.
The thing about abandoned buildings is that they lie. From the outside, they look empty, dead, forgotten by time. But if you've ever stepped inside one after dark, you know the feeling. That quiet pressure in the air, the strange sense that the building isn't abandoned at all. It's just watching. That's exactly how it felt the night 4 friends drove 30 minutes outside their town just to explore an old middle school everyone online had been talking about. The place had been shut down for years, windows shattered, fences rusted. The kind of place teenagers brag about sneaking into because it makes them feel fearless. They parked a few blocks away to avoid attention. 4 of them. Yuri driving, Frank in the passenger seat, Freddie in the back, and the narrator of this story sitting quietly beside him. Back then, this kind of night felt normal, just another stupid adventure. They brought spray paint to leave their mark on the walls, Roman candles left over from the 4th of July. The plan was simple: sneak inside, explore the building, climb to the roof and shoot fireworks into the sky and run before the police ever showed up. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual. At least, that's what they thought. When they approached the school, the first strange detail appeared. The perimeter fence had already been cut. Not bent, not climbed, cut clean open like someone had carefully made an entrance. At the time, they thought it was lucky. Urban explorers love when someone else has already done the hard work. But looking back, that hole in the fence should have been the first warning, because an open door in a dead place usually means one thing: someone else is already inside. Still, they crawled through the opening without thinking twice. Frank went first, Yuri behind him, then the narrator, Freddie last. Freddie was always the fearless one, the guy who laughed at creepy places, the one who said ghosts weren't real and danger was just something people invented to scare themselves. He volunteered to bring up the rear, watching the darkness behind them as they walked toward the school entrance. Inside, the silence swallowed them immediately. Their flashlights cut through long, empty hallways, broken tiles, exposed wires hanging from ceilings, old lockers half ripped from the walls, and a strange feeling none of them said out loud. Because sometimes a building doesn't feel abandoned. Sometimes it feels occupied.
Flashlights have a strange power in places like that. When the world around you is completely black, a narrow beam of light becomes the only thing separating control from chaos. Each of them carried powerful flashlights, the kind that could flood an entire room with white light for a few seconds before darkness swallowed everything again. At the time, they were proud of those lights. $60 for a flashlight felt ridiculous back then, but tonight it made them feel like explorers stepping into unknown territory. The first hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. Dust floated through the air like slow-moving ghosts. Their footsteps echoed off the cracked tile floor, bouncing down corridors that once carried the noise of hundreds of students every day. Now the building was dead silent. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it sloppy tags left by bored teenagers, some of it surprisingly detailed artwork. Frank and the narrator slowed down every now and then to study the better pieces. Graffiti had always been their thing. It was half the reason they came here in the first place. But Yuri kept pushing forward. He wasn't interested in the walls. He wanted to find the roof. Every abandoned building had a roof, and from a roof, fireworks looked incredible. They moved deeper into the school, passing classrooms stripped down to their skeletons, desks broken apart, whiteboards shattered, doors hanging crooked from rusted hinges. At one point, they found the auditorium. Even in decay, it was massive. Rows of old seats collapsing into dust, a stage half torn apart by time. For a moment, they stood there quietly, sweeping their flashlights across the room. It felt strangely peaceful. But the basement was different. The moment they walked down the stairs, the air changed, thicker, colder. Their lights caught insulation hanging from the ceiling like torn skin. Water stains spread across the concrete walls, and in the middle of one room, something painted on the floor, a massive pentagram. The symbol covered almost the entire space, drawn with thick black lines. None of them said anything for a few seconds. Urban explorers see stuff like that all the time. Teenagers love edgy symbols, but something about this one felt wrong. Maybe it was the size. Maybe it was the fact that it looked deliberate, not sloppy, not rushed, like whoever painted it had taken their time. Freddie laughed it off immediately. Just kids trying to be creepy. And maybe he was right. But none of them stayed in that basement very long, because even the fearless ones sometimes feel it. That quiet voice in your head that says, "You shouldn't be here."
Flashlights have a strange power in places like that. When the world around you is completely black, a narrow beam of light becomes the only thing separating control from chaos. Each of them carried powerful flashlights, the kind that could flood an entire room with white light for a few seconds before darkness swallowed everything again. At the time, they were proud of those lights. $60 for a flashlight felt ridiculous back then, but tonight it made them feel like explorers stepping into unknown territory. The first hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. Dust floated through the air like slow-moving ghosts. Their footsteps echoed off the cracked tile floor, bouncing down corridors that once carried the noise of hundreds of students every day. Now the building was dead silent. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it sloppy tags left by bored teenagers, some of it surprisingly detailed artwork. Frank and the narrator slowed down every now and then to study the better pieces. Graffiti had always been their thing. It was half the reason they came here in the first place. But Yuri kept pushing forward. He wasn't interested in the walls. He wanted to find the roof. Every abandoned building had a roof, and from a roof, fireworks looked incredible. They moved deeper into the school, passing classrooms stripped down to their skeletons, desks broken apart, whiteboards shattered, doors hanging crooked from rusted hinges. At one point, they found the auditorium. Even in decay, it was massive. Rows of old seats collapsing into dust, a half-torn-apart stage by time. For a moment they stood there quietly, sweeping their flashlights across the room. It felt strangely peaceful. But the basement was different. The moment they walked down the stairs, the air changed, thicker, colder. Their lights caught insulation hanging from the ceiling like torn skin. Water stains spread across the concrete walls. And in the middle of one room, something painted on the floor. A massive pentagram. The symbol covered almost the entire space, drawn with thick black lines. None of them said anything for a few seconds. Urban explorers see stuff like that all the time. Teenagers love edgy symbols. But something about this one felt wrong. Maybe it was the size. Maybe it was the fact that it looked deliberate, not sloppy, not rushed, like whoever painted it had taken their time. Freddie laughed it off immediately. Just kids trying to be creepy. And maybe he was right. But none of them stayed in that basement very long. Because even the fearless ones sometimes feel it. That quiet voice in your head that says, "You shouldn't be here."
They didn't stay in the basement long. No one said it directly, but the air down there had a weight to it, the kind that presses against your chest and makes your thoughts slow down. So they went back upstairs. The second floor felt less suffocating. The hallways were wider, and their flashlights reached further into the darkness. Dust-covered lockers lined the walls like silent witnesses to a life the building once had. This was where Frank and the narrator decided to stop. One classroom had something rare in an abandoned place, a perfectly clean wall. No graffiti, no broken plaster, just a blank white surface waiting for someone to claim it. Frank grinned immediately. To people like them, a wall like that isn't empty, it's an invitation. They dropped their bags, shook the spray cans, and got to work. The familiar hiss of paint echoed softly through the classroom, black and white lines spreading across the wall as they sketched out letters and shapes they had practiced for years.
Meanwhile, Yuri and Freddie got bored. They said they were going to explore further and try to find a stairwell leading to the roof. Their flashlights disappeared down a dark hallway. Just like that, the group split in half. Frank kept painting. The narrator stepped out into the hallway for a few minutes, slowly walking past other pieces of graffiti and studying them under his flashlight beam. Some of the art was impressive, real talent hidden in a place nobody would ever see. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again, just another late-night exploration. Then Frank shouted, not playful, not joking, angry. "Dude, quit messing with me!" The narrator turned around, confused. Frank was standing in the doorway holding his flashlight, scanning the room. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "My bag! I know you took it." The narrator walked back into the classroom. The bag that had been sitting next to the paint cans was gone, completely gone. They both searched the room quickly, sweeping their lights across the floor, behind desks, inside broken cabinets. Nothing. The bag had all the extra spray cans in it. Without it, they were done painting. Frank muttered in his breath. Freddie probably grabbed it as a joke. That sounded believable. Freddie had always been the type to pull dumb pranks. So they grabbed what they could carry and decided to go find the others. At first, it seemed simple. Walk down the hallway, find Yuri and Freddie. But abandoned schools have a strange way of twisting space. Hallways that look identical, staircases that lead to nowhere, rooms that all blur together. After a few minutes, they realized something uncomfortable. They had no idea where their friends were, and worse, they weren't completely sure how to get back out anymore. At first, getting lost didn't seem like a big deal. Abandoned buildings are confusing. Hallways repeat themselves. Staircases look identical. When every classroom door is broken and every wall is covered in graffiti, your sense of direction disappears quickly. So Frank and the narrator just laughed it off. "Yuri!" Frank shouted down the hallway. His voice echoed through the empty school, bouncing off walls and disappearing into the darkness. No answer. They kept walking, flashlights moving slowly across lockers and cracked floors, checking every open doorway they passed. "Freddie!" the narrator called this time. Again, nothing. That's when the silence started feeling different. Because even in empty places, you usually hear something. Wind moving through broken windows, water dripping somewhere in the distance, animals moving through the building. But this place had gone completely still. They reached another hallway intersection and stopped. "Dude, which way did they go?" the narrator asked. Frank shrugged. "Probably upstairs." So they found a staircase and started climbing. Each step groaned under their weight. Their flashlights cut long shadows across the walls as they reached the third floor. Up here, the building looked worse. Ceiling panels had collapsed. Parts of the hallway were blocked by piles of debris. And then they saw something. A light. Not a flashlight beam. A steady glow coming from a classroom further down the corridor. Both of them froze, because they hadn't brought any lights like that, and Yuri definitely hadn't either. Frank whispered, "You see that?" The narrator nodded slowly. Someone else was inside the school. They moved carefully now, stepping over broken tiles and pieces of drywall. As they got closer, they could hear something faint. Voices. Low. Calm. Talking. Frank immediately whispered, "Yo, maybe it's Yuri and Freddie messing with us." But something about the voices didn't sound like them. There were too many. At least 4, maybe 5 people. The glow grew brighter as they approached the classroom doorway. Then the narrator slowly leaned forward, just enough to look inside. And the moment he saw what was happening in that room, his stomach dropped. Because the people inside weren't exploring. They weren't teenagers, and they definitely weren't supposed to see anyone else in that building. The narrator only looked inside for a second, but that second was enough. Inside the classroom were 5 people standing around a table that had been dragged into the middle of the room. The light they saw wasn't a flashlight. It was candles, dozens of them. Their flames flickered against the cracked walls, casting long shadows that moved slowly across the ceiling. For a brief moment, none of the people inside noticed him. They were focused on something sitting on the table, something covered with a dark cloth. The narrator couldn't see exactly what it was, but the shape underneath looked wrong. Too large to be something small, too still to be something alive. Then one of the people spoke. His voice was calm, cold. "Did you hear something?" The narrator's heart nearly stopped. He immediately pulled his head back from the doorway. Frank saw his face and instantly understood something was very wrong. "How many?" Frank whispered. The narrator held up 5 fingers. Frank's expression changed immediately. This wasn't Yuri and Freddie playing a prank. This was 5 strangers, deep inside an abandoned building, in the middle of the night, standing around a candlelit table. And then the narrator heard something else. Footsteps, coming from behind them, slow, heavy, walking down the hallway they had just come from. Both of them turned their flashlights around at the same time. The beam of light cut through the darkness and stopped on a man standing about 30 feet away. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Tall, broad shoulders, face partially hidden under a hood. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The man stared directly into their flashlights. Then he slowly smiled, not surprised, not confused, like he had been expecting them. And then he said something that made the narrator's blood run cold. "You boys shouldn't be here." Behind them, the people in the candlelit room had gone silent, and now they were walking toward the hallway. For a moment, nobody moved. The man in the hallway stood perfectly still, staring into the flashlight beams like the light didn't bother him at all. Frank's grip tightened around his flashlight. Behind them, the narrator could hear movement in the candlelit room. Chairs scraping, footsteps, more people coming out into the hallway. And suddenly, the situation became very clear. 1 man in front of them, 5 more behind them. Frank whispered one word. "Run." They turned and sprinted down the hallway. Flashlight beams bounced wildly across the walls as their footsteps thundered through the abandoned school. Behind them, voices exploded into shouting. "Hey! Stop them!" The sound of multiple people running echoed through the corridor. The narrator's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. They reached a staircase and nearly slipped, rushing down the steps 2 at a time. The building that once felt empty now felt like a maze designed to trap them. Every hallway looked the same. Every turn felt wrong. "Where's the exit?" Frank shouted. "I don't know." Behind them, footsteps were getting louder. At least 3, maybe 4 people chasing them now. They burst through a set of double doors and found themselves in the gymnasium. The massive room stretched into darkness, their flashlights barely reaching the far wall. For half a second, they hesitated. Then Frank pointed. "Over there!" A side door. They ran toward it. The narrator slammed it open, and they rushed through, only to find themselves in another hallway. But something was different now. There was light ahead, real light, moonlight shining through broken glass doors at the end of the corridor. The exit. They sprinted toward it as fast as they could. Behind them, the footsteps were still coming, and just before they reached the doors, a voice shouted from somewhere in the darkness behind them, "Get the truck!" The words echoed through the building, and suddenly the narrator realized something far worse than being chased inside the school. Those people weren't just trying to scare them away. They were trying to catch them. The words echoed behind them. "Get the truck!" For a split second, the narrator's brain struggled to understand what that meant. But his body already knew. Run faster. They burst through the broken glass doors and stumbled outside into the cold night air. The sudden silence of the empty street felt unreal after the chaos inside the building. For half a second, both of them just kept running across the cracked parking lot, their flashlights shaking violently in their hands. "Where's the car?" the narrator shouted. Frank pointed toward the dark street. "2 blocks!" That suddenly felt very far away. Behind them, the school doors slammed open. Voices spilled out into the night, angry, panicked. Someone yelled, "This way!" The narrator glanced back. 3 men were already running across the parking lot, dark silhouettes under the moonlight. And then headlights exploded to life on the far side of the building. An engine roared. A truck. The narrator's stomach dropped. "They're bringing a truck!" Frank didn't even respond. They were already sprinting down the street as fast as their legs could carry them. The neighborhood around the school was completely empty. Old houses, dark windows, no lights, no people. Just the sound of their footsteps pounding against the pavement. Behind them, the truck engine grew louder, much louder. Then the headlights swung around the corner, flooding the entire street with blinding white light. The truck was coming straight toward them, fast, too fast. Frank grabbed the narrator's arm. "This way!" They suddenly cut between 2 houses and jumped a wooden fence into someone's backyard. The truck roared past the street behind them. Its tires screeched as it slammed on the brakes. Men shouting again. Doors opening. They weren't giving up, not even close. And in that moment, the narrator realized something terrifying. Those men hadn't just been exploring an abandoned school. They had been doing something inside that building. Something they were willing to chase people down in the middle of the night to protect. They crashed into the backyard hard. The narrator felt the air explode out of his lungs as he hit the ground. Frank rolled beside him, immediately scrambling back to his feet. "Move," Frank whispered harshly. They didn't dare run across the open yard. The truck headlights were still sweeping across the street behind the houses, bright beams cutting through fences and trees. So they crouched low and moved along the fence line. The grass was wet, soaking their shoes. Their breathing was loud, too loud. Every sound suddenly felt dangerous. Behind them, men were shouting again. "Split up! Check the backyards!" The narrator's stomach twisted. They were coming. Frank pointed toward the next fence. "Over!" They climbed it quickly, dropping into another dark backyard. This one had a small shed and a swing set creaking slowly in the wind. For a second, everything went quiet again. Then the truck engine roared somewhere nearby. Headlights flashed through the gaps between the houses. "They're driving around the block," the narrator whispered. Frank nodded. "They're trying to cut us off." That meant one thing. The car was now useless. Going back to the street where they parked would lead them straight into those headlights. They needed distance, more fences, more yards, anywhere but the road. They climbed another fence, then another, each jump harder than the last as exhaustion started creeping into their legs. Finally, they dropped into a backyard that backed up against something different. Trees, a thick patch of dark woods stretching behind the neighborhood. Frank didn't hesitate. "We go through there." The narrator looked at the trees. Normally, running blindly into the woods at night would feel like a terrible idea, but compared to the men hunting them with a truck, it was the only choice. They pushed through the tree line, branches snapping quietly under their feet as darkness swallowed them. The houses disappeared behind them. The truck engine faded into the distance. For several minutes, they just kept moving deeper into the woods, until finally they stopped. Both of them bent over, gasping for air, listening, waiting. No engines, no voices, just wind moving through the trees. For the first time since leaving the school, it seemed like they had escaped. But then the narrator asked the question neither of them had said out loud yet. "Frank, where are Yuri and Freddie?" And suddenly the night didn't feel safe anymore.
The question hung in the cold night air. "Frank, where are Yuri and Freddie?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He was still bent over, hands on his knees, trying to slow his breathing. Sweat mixed with the cold wind moving through the trees. Finally, he stood up and looked back toward the direction of the school. Far away now, but still somewhere beyond the dark neighborhood. "I don't know," he said quietly. The narrator's stomach tightened. Because the last time they had seen their friends, Yuri and Freddie were walking deeper into the building, looking for the roof. And now there were at least 6 dangerous strangers inside that same school. People who chased 2 teenagers through the streets with a truck just for seeing them. Frank ran a hand through his hair. Maybe they already got out. The narrator wanted to believe that. Maybe Yuri and Freddie had left through another exit. Maybe they were already back at the car, wondering where the others went. But deep down, something felt wrong, because if they had escaped, they would have been calling, texting, searching. Instead, their phones were completely silent. The narrator pulled his phone out and checked it. No signal. The woods were too thick. Frank tried his phone too. Same thing. They were completely cut off. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, just standing there in the dark forest, listening to distant sounds from the neighborhood far behind them. Then suddenly, the narrator's phone vibrated in his hand. A message. Not from Yuri, not from Freddie, just one single text from an unknown number. 3 words. "Come back now." Both of them stared at the screen, because there was only one way someone could send that message. Someone had Yuri or Freddie's phone, and they knew exactly who to send it to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The glow from the phone screen lit the narrator's face in the darkness. Frank slowly leaned closer. "Who sent it?" "I don't know," the narrator whispered. "It's an unknown number." Frank grabbed the phone and looked at the message again. "Come back now." 3 simple words, but they carried a weight that made the forest around them feel colder. Frank immediately shook his head. "No." "What do you mean, no?" the narrator said. "It's a trap." The narrator knew he was probably right.
Those men had chased them with a truck. They clearly didn't want witnesses. If they had Yuri or Freddy's phone, sending that message would be the easiest way to lure them back. Still, something about it didn't sit right. "Why would they want us to come back?" the narrator asked. Frank answered instantly, "So we don't tell anyone what we saw." That thought sent a chill down the narrator's spine, because it meant something else. If those men believed they could still control the situation, it meant Yuri and Freddy might already be in their hands. The phone vibrated again, another message. Both of them stared at the screen. This one was longer. "We know you're still close. Don't make this worse." Frank swore under his breath. They're watching. The narrator looked around instinctively. Dark trees, silent woods, nothing visible. But the idea that someone nearby could see them made the night suddenly feel suffocating. "How would they know we're still here?" the narrator asked. Frank's eyes moved slowly back toward the neighborhood, then the school beyond it. "Because they saw us run into the woods." The narrator realized something terrifying. If the men inside that truck had driven around the block, if they had searched the yards, then someone might have seen exactly where they disappeared, which meant those men knew the forest was the only place left to hide. Frank lowered his voice even more. "We need to keep moving." "But the message," Frank interrupted him, "doesn't matter." The narrator stared at the phone again. The screen was still glowing in the dark, that same message staring back at them. "Come back now." And suddenly, a horrible possibility crossed his mind. What if that message hadn't been sent by those men? What if it was Yuri or Freddy trying to warn them? The narrator kept staring at the phone. That one message replayed in his mind over and over. "Come back now." Frank thought it was a trap, and logically, it probably was. But something about it didn't feel like a threat. It felt urgent, almost desperate. "What if it's Freddy?" the narrator said quietly. Frank shook his head immediately. "No way." "But what if he got away and found a phone?" "Then he'd call, not send weird messages like that." The narrator knew that made sense. Still, the idea that their friends might be trapped back in that school wouldn't leave his mind. The phone vibrated again. Both of them flinched. Another message. This time it was only 2 words. "Last chance." Frank swore again. "That's it. We're leaving." He started moving deeper into the forest. The narrator followed, but he couldn't stop looking back at the screen, because something about the timing felt strange. If those men were sending messages, why weren't they coming after them? They had a truck, they had numbers, they could easily search the woods, but instead, they were just texting, almost like they wanted them to return on their own. Frank suddenly stopped walking. "Wait!" The narrator froze. "What?" Frank pointed through the trees. Far ahead, faint lights flickered through the branches. Street lights. Another road. If they could reach it, they might finally get a signal, maybe even find someone awake. A gas station, a house, anyone who could help. They started moving toward the lights as quietly as possible. Branches snapped under their shoes. Cold wind brushed through the forest. And slowly, the lights grew brighter. After about 10 minutes, they finally reached the edge of the woods. A narrow road stretched out in both directions, completely empty. But the moment the narrator's phone caught signal, it exploded with notifications. Missed calls, messages, dozens of them, all from one person. Freddy. Frank grabbed the phone immediately. When were these sent? The narrator scrolled through them. His heart dropped, because every message had been sent over an hour ago, long before the chase, long before the truck. Frank read the first one out loud, and the moment he finished, both of them felt the same cold realization. Freddy's message said, "Don't come upstairs." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The cold wind moved across the empty road, rustling the trees behind them. Frank kept staring at the phone screen. "Read the next one," he said quietly. The narrator scrolled down. The second message from Freddy appeared. "There are people here." Frank felt his chest tighten. Next, the narrator's finger moved again. "Not explorers." Another message appeared right after it. "Something is wrong." Frank looked back toward the dark forest they had just come out of, and somewhere far beyond that, the abandoned school. Freddy had sent these messages over an hour ago. That meant something terrifying. Freddy and Yuri had discovered those people long before Frank and the narrator ever reached the third floor, which meant when they saw the candles, when they saw the men in that room, they had already walked into something that was happening for a long time. "Keep reading," Frank said. The narrator opened the next message. "They have a truck." Both of them froze, because that message had been sent 20 minutes before they heard someone shout, "Get the truck!" Freddy had already seen it. He had already tried to warn them. But they never had signal inside the school, so the messages never reached them. The narrator kept scrolling. More texts appeared. "I think they saw us." Then another, "Don't come upstairs." And then the last message Freddy had ever sent, the one that made Frank slowly step back from the road. "They're coming." The timestamp showed it had been sent 5 minutes before Frank and the narrator started searching the hallways for them. Frank rubbed his face in frustration. "We walked right into it." The narrator felt sick. Freddy had tried to warn them over and over again, but none of the messages delivered until now, which meant Freddy and Yuri were somewhere inside that building, being chased long before the others even realized what was happening. Frank suddenly grabbed the phone again. "Call him." The narrator immediately pressed Freddy's number. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Then finally, someone answered. But it wasn't Freddy's voice. It was a man's voice, calm, low, almost amused, and the first thing he said made the narrator's blood run cold. "Glad you boys got the messages." The narrator couldn't speak. For a few seconds he just stared at the phone, his mind trying to process what he had just heard. Frank slowly leaned closer. "Who is it?" he whispered. The man on the other end of the line spoke again, calm, patient, like he wasn't in any hurry. "You ran pretty fast back there." The narrator felt his chest tighten. Frank grabbed the phone and switched it to speaker. "Where's Freddy?" Frank demanded. For a moment, the line was completely silent. Then the man chuckled quietly. "That's the wrong question." Frank's jaw clenched. "Then what's the right question?" Another short pause. "The right question is, how much did you see?" The narrator and Frank looked at each other. Neither of them answered, because the truth was they had seen enough. Candles, 5 men, something covered on a table, and a building those people clearly didn't want anyone near. The man spoke again. "You boys wandered into something you shouldn't have." Frank's voice turned cold. "If you hurt our friends, "You're not in a position to threaten anyone," the interrupted. His tone didn't change, still calm, still almost relaxed, which somehow made it even more terrifying. The narrator forced himself to speak. "What do you want?" The Anne answered immediately. "Come back." Frank shook his head before the narrator could even respond. "Not happening." The man sighed softly on the other end of the call. "I see. That's unfortunate." "Why?" Frank asked. Another pause. Then the man said something that made both of them freeze. "Because your friends already tried to run." The narrator felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean?" he asked. The man ignored the question. Instead, he continued speaking slowly. "Now we have a problem." Frank's voice rose. "What did you do to them?" The man finally answered, and his words felt like ice sliding down the narrator's spine. "We didn't do anything." Another pause. Then he added quietly, "But the people downstairs did." About 20 minutes later, the police arrived. Frank and the narrator had explained everything. The truck, the men, the candles, the phone call. At first, the officers seemed skeptical, but they still decided to check the school. 2 police cars pulled into the cracked parking lot. The building looked exactly the same, dark, broken, silent. They entered the school carefully. First floor, empty. Second floor, empty. Then the third floor, the same classroom where the narrator had seen the candles, but now there was nothing there. No table, no candles, no people, just an empty room covered in dust, like nobody had been there for years. Finally, the officers went down to the basement, and that's where they found something. The large pentagram was still painted across the floor, and lying next to it, 2 phones, Freddie's phone and Yuri's, but the 2 boys themselves were gone. Yuri and Freddie were never found. Police searched the school. They searched the surrounding woods. They even checked nearby towns. But there was no sign of them. The only evidence left behind were their 2 phones. And inside Freddie's phone, there was one last video. The video was shaky and dark. It had clearly been recorded in the basement. Candlelight flickered across the walls. Several people stood around the pentagram, their faces hidden in shadow. Then Freddie's voice whispered nervously, "Dude, these people are doing something. We should get out of here." Suddenly, the video jerked. There was a loud noise, a door slammed open, and someone shouted from across the room, "They saw us!" The video cut off instantly. That was the last thing ever recorded. The narrator says there is one thing he still thinks about today. The final words the man on the phone said before hanging up. A quiet sentence that still gives him chills. "You're lucky," the man had said. "You were only in the wrong place." Then he paused. "But your friends were in the wrong place and the wrong time." And sometimes those 2 mistakes together are the last ones a person ever makes.